After college, I packed my bags and moved to Southeast Washington for work. Fresh out of school, I was eager to explore the blue mountains that loomed near my new home. The peaks and ridges stretched endlessly, blanketed in a mix of pine forests and thick underbrush, with valleys dotted by meadows. The terrain was rugged and isolated, just the way I liked it. I'd grown up on a farm and ranch in Montana, where the outdoors weren't just a hobby, they were a way of life. I had a deep respect for the land and a hunter's instinct that had been honed since childhood. Learning the lay of the land for hunting season was my top priority, so I started taking scouting trips into the mountains. Each time, I'd choose locations far from public roads or access points. In my experience, few people venture far off the beaten path, and the more remote the area, the better my chances of finding unpressured game. It was the kind of solitude I thrived on, and being alone in the wilderness didn't bother me. If anything, it felt natural. On one of these trips, I decided to head out in the late afternoon. My plan was simple: hike a few miles in, find a good spot to camp, and spend the evening glassing for game at dusk. I didn't worry about the late start. I'd done this plenty of times before. My gear was light: a bivy sack, a small pack with essentials, and my trusty 1911 pistol. I'd packed just enough water and food for the trip and didn't bother with a fire, opting for a dry camp to stay as unobtrusive as possible. The hike in was uneventful, the forest alive with the usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I pushed through thick underbrush and scrambled up rocky inclines, eventually finding a small, level spot on a ridge to set up camp. The view was perfect. Rolling hills and valleys stretched out below me, and the fading sunlight bathed the landscape in shades of gold and purple. I spotted a couple of whitetails grazing in the distance as the sun dipped below the horizon. Nothing unusual, but it was a start. After a quick, cold meal, I settled into my bivy sack and let the stillness of the mountains lull me to sleep. Nights in the wilderness had always felt peaceful to me, a reminder of just how small and insignificant I was in the grand scheme of things. Around 1 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sharp, throbbing pain in my head. It wasn't just a regular headache. It came in waves, surging and then easing off, only to return with a vengeance. I lay still, trying to figure out what was happening. I'd been careful about staying hydrated on the hike in, so dehydration didn't seem likely. The air felt thinner than I'd remembered, and my breathing was shallow and uneven. Maybe it was altitude sickness, though I'd never experienced it before. As I lay there, another sound began to creep into my awareness. At first, I thought it was part of my headache, a ringing or distortion in my ears. But no, it was coming from outside, somewhere up the mountainside above me. A low, deep call echoed through the stillness, repeating at irregular intervals. My first thought was that it was some kind of animal. I'd grown up mimicking animal calls, fooling everything from coyotes to bull elk. My ear was trained to pick up on patterns and tones, and I could usually identify a sound within moments. But this was different. The call was loud, hollow, and resonant, with a strange cadence that didn't match anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't any mammal I could recognize. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Washington had birds I wasn't familiar with, ones that made odd calls at night. But the more I listened, the less convinced I became. It didn't just sound big. It felt big, the way the low rumble of a large predator can make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The headache wasn't letting up, and the call wasn't stopping. Every time it echoed through the trees, a cold knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me, but I couldn't convince myself to stay. By 2 a.m., I made the decision to pack up and leave. There was a gated road a few hundred yards above my camp that led back to the main road where my truck was parked. It wasn't the most direct route, but it was easier to navigate in the dark than bushwhacking back the way I'd come. The only problem was that the road would take me closer to the source of the call before circling back toward the truck. I packed up quickly, my movements deliberate but tense. With my 1911 in hand, I started up the ridge toward the road. The call continued, now seeming closer than before. It stayed above me, always just out of sight, as if something or someone was shadowing my movements. The rhythm of the sound never changed, and the steady repetition became almost hypnotic. Reaching the road felt like a small victory, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The sound was no more than 200 or 300 yards away now, moving parallel to me as I walked. My pace quickened, but I forced myself to stay quiet and avoid making too much noise. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen, hoping to pinpoint its location. Each time, it stopped too, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I've been followed by animals before, coyotes, bears, even the occasional mountain lion, but this felt different. There was an intelligence to the way it moved, always staying just out of sight, as if it knew the limits of my vision in the dark. The forest around me was dense, with thick undergrowth and towering pines that cast deep shadows even in the moonlight. I scanned the treeline constantly, my flashlight off to preserve my night vision, but I never saw anything. The road began to descend, and as I dropped lower into the valley, the call faded. My headache began to ease, and my breathing became more steady. By the time I reached the truck, the sound was gone entirely. I loaded my gear and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, the silence almost deafening after hours of that haunting call. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I needed to know what I'd heard. I started searching for recordings of animal calls from the Pacific Northwest, hoping to find a match. Elk, owls, coyotes, none of them came close. The sound was too distinct, too unique. It wasn't until I stumbled across a recording labeled "Bigfoot Whoops" that I froze. It was almost identical to what I'd heard in the mountains. I played the recording over and over, the hairs on my arms standing on end each time. It was uncanny. The tone, the cadence, it was all there. I grabbed a mouth reed and mimicked the sound, nailing it on the first try. There was no doubt in my mind that it was the same call. But what did it mean? Was it really some unknown creature? Or had I just stumbled onto something I didn't understand? I returned to the area a few more times, determined to find an explanation. I hiked through the thick north slope where the sound had originated, but the terrain was so dense and overgrown that it was nearly impassable. I never heard the call again, and I never saw anything unusual. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night in the blues. Maybe it was just an animal I couldn't identify, or maybe it was something more. All I know is that the sound still echoes in my memory, as clear and haunting as the night I first heard it. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I find myself listening for it, half hoping I'll hear it again, and half hoping I won't. Moving back to Georgia from the quiet expanse of southern Oregon felt like stepping into another world. After years of living in the remote state of Jefferson, the noise and congestion of city life had become suffocating. The traffic, the constant buzz, the absence of stars. It wore on me, each day chiseling away at my sanity. I needed to get away, to feel the ground under my boots and the vastness of nature surrounding me, just like I used to in Oregon. It was Valentine's Day when I decided to take that much-needed escape. I packed my gear and drove up toward Helen, deep into the Appalachian foothills. My plan was simple: camp out for the night, light a fire, and let the crisp mountain air clear my mind. The forest roads were empty, the kind of quiet that city folks find unnerving but that I craved. The dirt road wound through the trees, 7 miles deep before winter closures stopped me from driving further. I saw no other cars or signs of life on the way in, just the trees, the occasional creek, and the crunch of gravel beneath my tires. It was perfect. I set up camp by a creek right off the road, the sound of running water mixing with the whisper of the wind through the trees. My tent was pitched close enough to the fire pit that I wouldn't need to stumble too far in the dark, and I settled into the familiar rhythm of camping alone. The fire crackled and popped as daylight faded, the orange flames warming the chill creeping in from the creek. I was alone, or so I thought. It was still light when I heard the rumble of a truck coming up the road. The sound grew louder, and soon, an old pickup rounded the bend, slowing as it came into view of my campsite. Two men sat in the cab, their windows rolled down. Even from a distance, I could see the bottle of liquor one of them was holding. They didn't step out of the truck but lingered, their eyes scanning my campsite. I could feel their gaze on me, heavy and invasive. One of them asked about the road closure, his voice gruff and slurred just enough to betray how much he'd already had to drink. I explained as briefly as I could, keeping my tone neutral but firm. My mind raced as I noticed their eyes darting to the lone chair by the fire, the single plate near my tent. I made a point to glance at the tent and casually mentioned that we were only staying one night, as if I wasn't alone. They didn't linger much longer, but their presence unsettled me. Their truck rolled on, disappearing around the bend, but I couldn't shake the unease they left behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. They'd probably been curious, maybe a little nosy, but nothing more. Still, the image of their leering faces kept replaying in my mind. Darkness fell, and the forest grew colder, the sounds of the creek and the distant hoots of owls my only company. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight, but I couldn't relax. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch made my heart race. I imagined those men coming back, creeping through the woods, waiting for me to drift off to sleep. I considered moving to the truck bed, where I'd be more protected by the camper shell, but the thought of lying there, wide awake, with the tent standing as a decoy didn't sit right either. My nerves were raw, my mind spinning through scenarios. What if they returned? What if they were armed? Finally, I decided to leave. I didn't even try to sleep. The fire was dying down, the embers glowing faintly as I poured water over them and stomped out any remaining sparks. The forest seemed to press in closer as I packed up, every shadow feeling more menacing than the last. As I climbed into my truck and started the engine, relief washed over me, but it didn't last. I hadn't driven more than 100 yards when my headlights illuminated a shape ahead on the road. My stomach dropped. It was the same truck, parked around the bend. My pulse thundered in my ears as I slowed. The men were sitting in the cab, their truck idling. They must have been waiting for hours, and for what? The second I passed them, their engine roared to life, and they pulled out behind me. My heart raced as their headlights filled my rearview mirror. The narrow dirt road twisted and turned, with steep drop-offs on one side and dense woods on the other. There was no room to pull over, no way to turn around. They followed me, staying close enough that I couldn't see anything but their headlights. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my mind racing through the possibilities. If they tried to block me in or force me off the road, what could I do? Running their truck off the edge seemed like a desperate, dangerous move, but the thought of stopping and facing them was worse. The 7-mile stretch back to the main road felt like an eternity. The dirt road was rough, and every bump and jolt rattled through my bones. I kept my speed steady, not too fast to lose control, but not slow enough to make myself an easier target. Finally, the main road came into view, the dark expanse of asphalt stretching out in both directions. I turned onto it without hesitation, my tires skidding slightly on the gravel before finding traction. The truck didn't follow me. As soon as I hit the pavement, they veered off onto a side road, their taillights disappearing into the trees. I drove until I reached the nearest town, my hands still shaking as I pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel. The clerk at the front desk must have seen the fear in my eyes. I told them what happened, giving a description of the truck and the license plate number. They called the sheriff's department, and I stayed in that motel room, locked up tight until morning. I don't know what those men had planned, and I don't want to know. Maybe they were just drunk and bored, or maybe their intentions were far darker. All I know is that leaving when I did probably saved my life. That night left a scar, a reminder that even in the peace of the wilderness, danger can lurk just out of sight. It hasn't stopped me from camping or seeking solace in nature, but I'm more cautious now. I trust my gut, and I don't take risks. Georgia wasn't for me. I returned to Oregon not long after, back to the forests and mountains that feel like home. Out there, I'm careful, but I'm also at peace, surrounded by the wild beauty that first stole my heart. Growing up in the woods, my family and I had our share of eerie and strange encounters. Some were laughable in hindsight, like that time a skunk wandered into our campsite and caused chaos. Others, like this story, remain an unsettling mystery I still can't explain. Even years later, I can't fully wrap my head around what happened that night. My parents owned 35 acres of dense forest deep in the Rockies, roughly a 2 to 3 hour drive from our home. That place was our haven, a slice of untouched wilderness where we could camp, explore, and just be free. My parents, both seasoned campers and backpackers, were well versed in the dangers of the outdoors. They'd grown up in these mountains, and their confidence made us kids feel safe, no matter how isolated we were. It was late summer when this particular incident took place. We decided to head up to the property for a weekend camping trip. My younger brother and I were ecstatic. Even the long drive through winding mountain roads didn't dampen our spirits. By the time we reached the property, it was well past 9 p.m. The sky was a deep, inky black, scattered with stars. The air was crisp, cooler than it had been down in the city, and smelled like pine and damp earth. We were all tired from the drive, but eager to set up camp and settle in for the night. The headlights from the car cast long, flickering shadows across the trees as we began unloading our gear. That's when we first noticed something was off. The moment we stepped out of the car, an uneasy feeling washed over all of us. It wasn't the usual we're in the wild kind of alertness. This was heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. My parents exchanged a quick glance, and I could tell they felt it too. The forest, usually alive with the hum of insects and distant calls of night birds, was utterly silent. Dead silent. It was unnatural. Even as kids, we knew the forest had its own soundtrack at night. Crickets chirping, owls hooting, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But now there was nothing. Just the sound of our own footsteps crunching against the dirt and the occasional clink of metal as we set up camp. We laughed nervously, chalking it up to fatigue or paranoia, and got to work. My dad started assembling the large tent we all shared, while my mom busied herself organizing the gear. My brother and I were tasked with gathering firewood, but even that felt off. Every step away from the car made the uneasy feeling worse, like the forest itself was watching us. As we worked, we started to hear faint rustling in the trees above us. At first, it was subtle, just the occasional crack of a branch or a soft rustle of leaves. But it grew louder and more persistent, coming from multiple directions. Whatever was up there wasn't small. The branches creaked and groaned under its weight, and the sounds were clumsy, like something large and unfamiliar was moving through the canopy. I remember looking at my brother, his face pale in the dim light of our headlamps. "What is that?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. The noises intensified, accompanied by strange calls, eerily human, yet not quite. They were guttural and sharp, like someone trying to mimic an animal but getting it wrong. These calls echoed through the trees, answering each other from every direction. By then, we were all on edge. My parents, usually calm and collected in the face of danger, looked genuinely alarmed. My mom, who once followed a grizzly bear for half a mile to get a good photo, stood frozen, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The tent was finally up, and my parents ushered my brother and me inside, telling us to stay put. I didn't argue. Huddled together with our 2 dogs, we listened as my parents ventured out with their flashlights, their voices low and tense. The sounds grew louder while they were gone. Branches cracking, calls echoing, and what almost sounded like whispers carried on the wind. The dogs, usually fearless, were cowering between us, their ears flat against their heads. When my parents returned, they looked shaken. My dad, who rarely showed fear, had a tightness in his jaw I'd never seen before. "We didn't see anything," he muttered, but his tone didn't match his words. We stayed in the tent, listening to the cacophony outside. It felt like the forest was alive, and not in a way we were used to. The noises surrounded us, moving closer, then farther away, then closer again. The oppressive silence from earlier had been replaced by a chaotic symphony of sounds that made no sense. At some point, my dad decided to step out again. He unzipped the tent, and the second the flap opened, the noises stopped. Completely, it was like someone had flipped a switch. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the forest was eerily calm. My parents stepped outside again, searching the area with their flashlights. They found nothing. No animals, no signs of movement, just fallen branches and a few strange marks high up on some of the trees. Eventually, they came back to the tent and tried to reassure us. "It's probably nothing," my dad said, though his tone was unconvincing. Despite the lingering unease, we somehow managed to fall asleep, huddled together with the dogs between us. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The forest was alive again, filled with the familiar sounds of birds and insects. In the daylight, the unease of the previous night felt like a bad dream. But the marks on the trees remained, a series of deep scratches and gouges that none of us could explain. They were too high for any animal we knew, and the spacing was strange, almost deliberate. We packed up and left earlier than planned, all of us eager to get back to the safety of home. My parents didn't talk much on the drive back, and when we got home, they didn't bring up what had happened. But over the years, it became a story we revisited, always with the same unanswered questions. What were those sounds? What caused the strange marks? And why did everything stop so abruptly when my dad stepped outside? To this day, I don't have an explanation. It wasn't an animal we could identify, and it wasn't a trick of the mind. It felt real, too real to dismiss, and that's what makes it so unsettling. It was my 3rd summer working as a counselor at a Boy Scout summer camp nestled deep in the woods. By that point, I'd gotten pretty comfortable with the rhythm of the job. Each week, a new batch of campers would arrive, eager to earn their badges and experience the outdoors. My favorite part of the week, and arguably the most nerve-wracking, was taking the kids to the wilderness survival spot for their badge work. The spot was only about half a mile from the main camp, but we made the journey feel much longer by leading the group through a winding, overgrown trail. The idea was to give the illusion of isolation, a place where they could imagine themselves truly fending for themselves in the wilderness. That night started like every other. We arrived at the spot in the late afternoon, and I gave my usual instructions on building shelters using sticks, leaves, and anything else they could scavenge from the forest floor. The kids dove into their task with a mix of excitement and nervous energy, and before long, they'd constructed a small village of unevenly built lean-tos. Some looked like they could survive a hurricane. Others looked like they might collapse if the wind so much as shifted direction. We cooked dinner over the fire, simple camp meals of foil-wrapped hot dogs and potatoes. The kids laughed and joked as they ate, the light from the fire reflecting in their wide, eager eyes. Darkness crept in slowly, wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. By 11 o'clock, it was time to send the kids to their shelters for the night. I reminded them to stay put unless they absolutely had to get up for something, and that the staffers and I would be nearby in case of emergencies. As the kids shuffled off to their makeshift shelters, the night seemed to grow heavier. I stayed by the campfire, tidying up and making sure the flames were safely dying down. It was while I was crouched over the fire pit, brushing dirt over the embers, that I first heard it. A faint sound drifted through the air, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Bells. Church bells. I paused, leaning into the night to confirm what I was hearing. My fellow staffers, Nate and Emily, were a few yards away, talking in low voices. They stopped mid-sentence, their heads turning in the same direction as mine. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nate nodded slowly. "Yeah, bells." The three of us stood there in silence, listening as the faint chime rang out again. It was rhythmic, steady every 30 seconds or so. We exchanged uneasy glances. There were no towns or churches anywhere near the camp. The nearest settlement was more than 20 miles away, and even if there had been a church close by, why would the bells be ringing this late? For 30 minutes, the sound continued. Each chime seemed to echo a little longer than the one before, lingering in the cool night air. The campers were still quiet in their shelters, but I could feel the tension building. The woods, usually alive with the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves, seemed unnaturally still. Then, as abruptly as the bells started, they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I glanced at Nate and Emily, hoping one of them would say something to break the tension, but they just stared into the darkness with the same unease I felt. And then came the singing. Started faint just like the bells. So faint I thought I might be imagining it. But as I strained to listen, the sound became unmistakable. Voices, dozens of them, maybe more, rising and falling in a hauntingly melodic chant. It wasn't like any church choir I'd ever heard. The harmony was there, but the energy was unsettling. It wasn't peaceful or soothing. It was fervent, almost manic, and it carried a weight that pressed down on my chest. The singing ebbed and flowed. At times, it seemed to fade into the distance, so quiet I could barely catch it. Then, suddenly, it would swell, loud and forceful, as if the unseen choir was moving closer. The effect was disorienting, and I found myself turning in circles, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. The campers began to stir. I could hear the rustle of sleeping bags and the hushed whispers of nervous boys. My heart sank. I knew I had to do something before their fear spiraled out of control. "Everything's fine," I called out, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "There's a church service going on back at the main camp. That's what you're hearing." It was a blatant lie, but what else could I say? That I had no idea what was happening? That I was just as scared as they were? The lie seemed to work, at least for the moment. The whispers quieted, and the rustling stopped. But the singing continued. Minutes dragged into hours. The staffers and I sat by the smoldering fire, too uneasy to move. Every so often, I'd get up and make a round of the shelters, reassuring the kids that everything was okay. They didn't question me, but their wide eyes told me they weren't convinced. By the time the singing finally stopped, it was almost 1 a.m. The silence that followed was somehow even worse. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. I didn't sleep that night, and I don't think anyone else did either. The next morning, we packed up and made our way back to the main camp. The kids were unusually quiet, their usual chatter replaced by a somber, almost shell-shocked silence. I didn't blame them. I felt the same way. It wasn't until a few days later that I found out what had happened. One of the senior staff members mentioned it offhand, as if it were no big deal. There had been a large Ku Klux Klan rally just a few miles from the camp that night. The bells, the singing, it all made sense in the worst possible way. I didn't tell the campers what I'd learned. What good would it have done? They'd heard the sounds, felt the fear. They didn't need to know the details to understand that something deeply unsettling had happened that night. Even now, years later, the memory sticks with me. It wasn't the ghost story I'd imagined when I first heard the bells, but it was far more horrifying. It was a stark reminder of the darkness that can linger just out of sight, closer than you'd ever want to believe. The sky turned a deep shade of navy as the last hints of sunlight faded behind the treetops. We were camping by a lake, not too far from the town. For once not on one of my usual through-hiking adventures deep in the wilderness. This trip wasn't about solitude or reconnecting with nature. It was about getting drunk with old classmates. We had a few tents set up, though I generally avoided them on my solo trips. They were heavy, cumbersome, and often forbidden in the mountains I frequented. But this was different. We weren't far from civilization, and the tents provided a convenient excuse to focus on having fun without worrying about the night's discomfort. The fire crackled in front of us, illuminating our circle as we passed around bottles and laughed over old stories. At some point, the flames started to die down, and someone suggested gathering more wood to keep it going through the night. I volunteered along with my friend, figuring it would be an easy task and a good excuse to stretch my legs. The forest loomed not far from our campsite, the kind of dense greenery that looks inviting during the day but turns eerie as soon as darkness takes over. We grabbed a couple of small flashlights and headed toward the trees. As we approached the forest's edge, we noticed another tent pitched slightly out of sight of our camp. It wasn't unusual for others to camp here. The lake was a popular spot, but something about it felt a little off. Maybe it was the heavy tarps covering the setup, or the fact that the tent looked like it had been there for several days. Either way, we paid it little mind and continued on our way. As we passed the tent, a man emerged from it. He was older than us, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, with a wiry build and a scruffy beard. He smiled and started chatting with us. It was the kind of small talk you expect from fellow campers. How long we were staying, how great the lake was, and so on. There was nothing overtly strange about him. He seemed friendly enough. At one point, he suggested we split up to cover more ground, pointing out two paths that branched off from the main trail. It made sense. We'd gather wood faster that way. So, I took one path while my friend took the other, which was slightly higher up and ran parallel to mine. The forest felt alive around me, the sounds of rustling leaves and distant calls of animals filling the air. My flashlight beam bobbed along the ground as I searched for decent-sized branches to carry back. I was about halfway down the trail when I heard my friend shout my name from above. I turned, the flashlight sweeping through the trees, and saw him waving frantically. His voice was sharp, panicked in a way that made my stomach twist. When I looked down the path behind me, my heart nearly stopped. The man from the tent was following me, and in his hand was a machete. He called out something about how he'd realized we didn't have any tools to chop wood and thought he'd come to help. His tone was casual, but the sight of that blade in his hand made my skin crawl. I stammered out a polite refusal, thanking him for the offer but insisting I didn't need help. Then I turned and walked as quickly as I could toward my friend, who was already making his way down to meet me. We regrouped and hurried back to our campsite, our arms empty of wood but our minds racing. The others laughed when we told them what had happened, brushing it off as paranoia. He was probably just trying to be helpful, one of them said, and for a moment I wondered if they were right. Maybe we were overreacting, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Night fell, and we returned to drinking and chatting, the earlier incident almost forgotten. Almost. The fire had burned low again, and we were debating whether to let it die out when a beam of light appeared in the distance. A headlamp bobbing closer. The man from the tent was coming toward us, his arms full of wood. He walked into our campsite like he belonged there, dumping the wood near the fire and grinning. "Figured you'd need more," he said. His tone was friendly enough, but the way he moved, the way his eyes lingered on our tents, on each of us, made my skin crawl. He circled the camp slowly, asking casual questions that felt anything but, "Is this all of you? Anyone else coming?" We mumbled answers, trying to keep the conversation short. The air was thick with tension, and no one seemed to know what to say. After a few long, uncomfortable minutes, he told us to enjoy our night and left, his headlamp bobbing back toward the forest. We sat in silence for a while after he was gone, the unease settling over us like a heavy blanket. Theories started to fly. Maybe he wanted to make sure we wouldn't let the fire die out, so he'd know when we were asleep. Maybe the occasional flash of light from his campsite was the glint of binoculars. We didn't know, and that was the worst part, the not knowing. None of us slept that night. We sat in a tense, watchful silence, taking turns keeping an eye on the fire and the woods around us. When dawn finally broke, we packed up our gear and left as quickly as we could, our laughter from the night before replaced by a heavy, lingering fear. On another trip, deep in the woods far from any trail, I had an experience that still makes my skin crawl. We were on a climbing trip, a group of 4, sleeping under the stars because tents were both too heavy and prohibited in the area. We'd spent the day scaling rock faces and were exhausted by the time we set up camp. Dinner was a simple affair, MREs and a bit of wine, and we talked until the stars were bright overhead, then settled into our sleeping bags. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke to the sound of voices. Not one or two, but many, a cacophony of chatter that sounded like a group of kids walking through the woods. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the voices grew louder, closer, and soon I realized everyone else was awake too, sitting up and listening in silence. The forest was supposed to be empty. We'd gone far off the beaten path to avoid rangers and other hikers. Yet here were these voices, dozens of them, cutting through the still night air. The first group passed in the distance, their chatter fading as quickly as it had appeared. Then another group came, closer this time. We sat frozen, barely breathing, as the voices moved past. It was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. Then came the sound of footsteps approaching our campsite. A group of 5 kids, maybe 13 years old, emerged from the trees. They didn't have flashlights or headlamps, just moved quietly through the moonlit forest like they'd done it 1,000 times before. They didn't say a word, just nodded in our direction as they passed a few meters from our sleeping bags and continued on, following the path of the other voices. We didn't move until they were gone, their footsteps fading into the distance. The rest of the night was a blur of whispered speculations and strained listening, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig setting us on edge. By morning, we were too shaken to linger. We packed up and left, the weight of the night hanging heavy over us. I've encountered wild animals in the woods, heard the blood-curdling shrieks of foxes, and woken to wild hogs rummaging through my gear. But nothing, not the animals, not the wilderness itself, has ever terrified me the way people do. Out there in the woods, away from the rules and norms of society, you realize how unpredictable humans can be. And that's a fear that stays with you long after you've left the forest behind. The day began like any other, the kind of morning you dream about when you plan a big hike. The crisp, alpine air filled my lungs as we stood at the trailhead. The towering peak in front of us loomed high, the kind of challenge I'd always found exciting. even though I knew it would test my limits. My dad was beside me, checking our gear one last time. Around us, the group of hikers, including our guide, milled about, stretching or adjusting their packs. Everyone was eager to start. The plan was simple: hike up the mountain, camp at the base of the summit, and push to the top the next morning. It wasn't my first time doing a 14K, but this trip felt more intense. Higher elevation, colder temperatures, and a remote location. We set off at a steady pace, the rhythm of our boots crunching on the trail blending with the soft rustle of the trees swaying in the wind. The trail snaked upward through dense forest, gradually narrowing. The incline was manageable at first, and we kept a good pace, chatting casually and soaking in the beauty of the surroundings. An hour in, I felt great. My muscles were warm, my breathing steady. The sun filtered through the canopy, creating dappled light patterns on the ground. As we climbed higher, the air grew thinner, cooler, and quieter, save for the occasional bird call or the distant sound of a stream. We came to a steep embankment about 3 hours into the hike. It wasn't anything too technical, but the ground was loose, and I could see my dad ahead, already halfway up, offering his hand to help me climb. I reached up instinctively, my fingers wrapping around his. The look on his face was immediate and alarming. "Your hand's ice cold," he said, his brow furrowing. I frowned. I hadn't noticed. My fingers didn't feel numb, just cold, but I chalked it up to the temperature. We were above the treeline now, and the wind had picked up. I thought maybe I just hadn't been moving enough. He paused, still holding my hand, before calling over the guide. "Can you check her pulse?" The guide approached, his face serious but calm. He pressed his fingers to my wrist, then my forearm, then moved higher. His brows knit tighter with each attempt. "I can't feel a pulse," he said finally, glancing at my dad. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's probably just the cold," the guide reassured me, but his tone was cautious. "Let's check your other arm." The same thing. No pulse at the wrist, none at the forearm. Even up to my bicep, the blood flow seemed non-existent. We stopped the hike briefly while they checked my vitals more thoroughly. My heart rate was fine, my breathing steady, and I felt no pain or discomfort. It was bizarre. Despite the lack of a pulse, I felt completely normal, apart from my hands being cold. The guy tried to use his satellite phone to call for advice or help, but the device wasn't working. Whether it was a technical issue or interference from the terrain, we couldn't get a signal. The decision was made to press on to the base camp, about an hour away. It was the most logical choice. The guide thought I might be experiencing the early stages of hypothermia, and they wanted to get me there as quickly as possible to warm me up and monitor me more closely. They took my pack to lighten my load and kept a close eye on me, stopping every 15 minutes to check my vitals. Each time, the same result. No pulse in my arms, though I still felt fine. My dad stayed close, his worry visible despite his efforts to stay calm. The hike to base camp felt like it dragged on forever. The trail was steeper now, and the air thinner. My arms were still cold, and I found myself moving more cautiously, hyper-aware of my body. The group was quiet, the atmosphere tense. When we finally reached the camp, I felt a wave of relief. The tents were already set up from a previous trip, and we quickly got to work warming me up. They wrapped me in layers, gave me hot drinks, and massaged my arms and hands to stimulate blood flow. After a couple of hours, some warmth returned to my arms. My pulse was faint but detectable, and everyone breathed a little easier. We decided to stay the night and reassess in the morning. I woke up just as the first light broke over the horizon. The air inside the tent was frigid, and as I sat up, I realized immediately that something was wrong. My arms were ice cold again, even colder than the day before. I rubbed them briskly, trying to warm them, but it didn't help. When I stepped out of the tent, My dad and the guide took one look at me and knew. The decision was made to leave most of our gear behind and make a fast descent. We set off in a group of 4. My dad, the guide, an experienced hiker, and me. The rest of the group would follow later with the equipment. Moving fast and light, we alternated between jogging and sprinting down the trail. The descent was grueling. My legs burned with every step, and the cold air bit at my face and hands. Despite the exertion, my arms remained icy. I could feel the tension in the group as we pushed forward. Everyone focused on getting me down as quickly as possible. When we finally reached the base of the mountain, the relief was almost overwhelming. My arms were still cold, but the feelings started to return as we drove to the nearest hospital. By the time we arrived, my pulse was detectable again, though weak. The doctors ran tests and eventually diagnosed me with Raynaud's syndrome. It was a strange relief to have an explanation. The condition meant that the muscles around my blood vessels were thicker than normal, and at high altitudes and low temperatures, they constricted so much that they completely cut off blood flow to my extremities. It was a dramatic diagnosis for something I'd never even heard of before, but it made sense. The combination of cold and altitude had pushed my body to its limit, revealing something I might not have discovered otherwise. Looking back, the experience was terrifying but humbling. It reminded me how fragile and resilient the human body can be, all at once. Raynaud's isn't life-threatening, but in the wrong conditions, it could have been dangerous. Now, I take extra precautions when hiking or spending time in cold environments. I learned to listen to my body and never take its signals lightly. That mountain taught me more than just how to push through a challenging hike. It showed me how incredible and mysterious the human body truly is. We thought we were prepared for adventure. In our late 20s, full of energy and naivete, my husband and I had set out to explore the wilderness of Africa. We were teachers in Lesotho at the time, and during our breaks, we often packed up our modest gear, strapped our infant daughter into the car, and headed off to discover the vast parks of Zimbabwe. The scenery was breathtaking. Rolling savannas, ancient baobabs, and the sound of life everywhere. It was the sort of beauty that made you forget caution, made you feel invincible. But looking back, I realized how young and foolish we were. That particular trip had been spontaneous. We had a small tent, some supplies, and our baby girl, who was less than a year old. She was a lively little thing, always babbling and giggling, her innocence a constant source of joy and worry. We didn't think much about the risks. Africa was vast, wild, and unpredictable. But in our hubris, we convinced ourselves that we could handle it. We set up camp in a remote area of the park, far from any other travelers or rangers. The isolation felt thrilling, like we were truly alone with nature. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson before giving way to the inky blackness of night. The sounds of the bush came alive. Crickets chirping, distant hoots of owls, the occasional rustle of leaves. It was both peaceful and unnerving. Our tent was modest but enough for the 3 of us. My husband and I laid our daughter between us, her tiny form wrapped in blankets, her breathing soft and rhythmic. As the night deepened, we drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sounds of the wild. I don't know what woke me first, the sound or the feeling of something being off. It was a low, guttural noise, almost like a cough, but rougher, wetter. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there, frozen, listening. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by another and then another. It wasn't one animal. It was a pack. Hyenas. My chest tightened as I realized what was happening. Their eerie whoops and laughs, so distinctive, sent a chill down my spine. I nudged my husband awake, and he tensed immediately, his instincts catching on as quickly as mine. Our daughter stirred, making soft cooing noises in her sleep, oblivious to the danger. My heart raced as I realized that her sounds were drawing the animals closer. The cough-like noises grew louder, and soon we could hear the shuffling of paws on the dry earth outside the tent. The hyenas were circling. We hadn't brought any weapons, no firearms, no knife, not even an axe. It seems so foolish now, but at the time we hadn't thought we'd need them. After all, we were just camping, right? The thought of being defenseless in the face of predators was a cold, hard slap of reality. The tent fabric was thin, offering no real protection. Every noise from outside felt amplified. Sniffing, grunting, the scrape of claws against the ground. Then something pressed against the side of the tent. A snout. It sniffed loudly, the sound so close I could feel the vibration of its breath. Panic set in. My husband whispered for me to stay still, but my mind raced. Our daughter had begun to cry, the high-pitched wails piercing the air. The sniffing grew more insistent, and then, horrifyingly, the hyena began to paw at the ground, trying to dig under the edge of the tent. I could see its shadow through the fabric, its hunched shape, its movements deliberate and determined. The rest of the pack was still outside, their noises a chaotic mix of cackles and whines, but this one was trying to get in. My maternal instincts kicked in, a primal, ferocious need to protect my child at all costs. I didn't think. I acted. I lunged forward and punched the snout of the hyena as hard as I could. The tent fabric softened the blow, but it connected, and the hyena let out a loud, startled yelp. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a mix of pain and fear. For a moment, everything went silent. Then chaos erupted. The pack scattered, their whoops and cries fading into the distance as they fled. The one I'd hit didn't linger either. Its heavy footsteps thudded away, leaving us alone in the tense, trembling silence of the night. I sat back, my fist throbbing, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. My husband held our daughter tightly, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. She had stopped crying, her little face pressed against his chest, her soft breaths the only sound in the tent. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As dawn broke, we stepped outside to survey the damage. The ground around our tent was marked with paw prints, deep gouges where the hyenas had tried to dig. The air still carried the faint, acrid smell of animals. It was a sobering sight. We realized just how close we had come to disaster. That morning, we packed up and left, our dream of wilderness adventure replaced by a newfound respect for the dangers of the wild. We had been lucky, so incredibly lucky, and we knew it. To this day, the memory of that night stays with me. The sounds, the fear, the raw, unfiltered instinct to protect my child. It's all etched into my mind like a scar. My husband and I often talk about it, marveling at the sheer stupidity of our younger selves and the thin line between life and death we had walked that night. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't acted, if I hadn't punched that hyena. Maybe it would have dug its way in. Maybe the pack would have followed. But it didn't, and for that, I am endlessly grateful. The night air was sharp and biting as we stepped out of the cabin, our laughter fading into uneasy silence. It was past 1 a.m., and the new moon left the world shrouded in darkness. The idea to go hiking at this hour, with only the faint starlight above, seemed thrilling in the cozy safety of the cabin. Now, standing on the edge of the shadowy woods, it felt like the plot of one of the horror movies we'd just been laughing at. There were 5 of us, me, Dan, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa. We'd known each other since high school, and this cabin had always been our getaway spot. My parents owned the place, a simple wooden structure perched on a ridge, surrounded by thick woods. Isolation was part of its charm, and it was always a little eerie at night. After watching the Blair Witch Project and tossing back a few drinks, someone, probably Mike, suggested a nighttime hike to add some real adventure to the weekend. The first steps into the woods felt like stepping into another world. Without the lantern we'd packed, we'd be lost in the inky blackness. Trees loomed over us like towering shadows, their branches creaking in the wind. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of unseen creatures, felt magnified in the silence. We stayed close together, the weak beam of the lantern cutting a narrow path ahead. The alcohol buzz helped dull the cold, but the wind still stung our cheeks and carried a faint smell of damp earth and pine. We made our way downhill, the terrain steep and uneven. The gully at the base of the ridge was a favorite spot of ours during the day, a quiet place to relax and feel completely removed from the world. But at night, it was different. The absence of light made every step uncertain, every sound suspect. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my imagination conjuring shapes and figures from the shadows. When we finally reached the gully, we collapsed into a circle on the cold ground. The lantern's glow felt reassuring, even if it barely pushed back the darkness. I could see the pale faces of my friends, their expressions a mix of excitement and unease. For a moment, we sat in silence, catching our breath and listening to the distant rustle of leaves. The quiet was both peaceful and unsettling. Then it happened. The scream cut through the night like a jagged blade, echoing off the trees and making my skin crawl. It wasn't just loud. It was visceral, raw. It sounded like a woman, and it was filled with a kind of terror I'd never heard before, like someone being ripped apart. We froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. For what felt like an eternity, we just sat there, staring at each other, too stunned to move. Then it came again, the same blood-curdling scream, this time closer, cutting through the stillness like a warning. Someone reached over and clicked off the lantern, plunging us into darkness. My eyes strained against it, trying to see anything, but there was nothing, just black. The air felt heavier, charged with something primal. Without saying a word, we scrambled to our feet and started running. The climb back up the ridge was brutal. The steep incline and loose dirt made every step a fight. My legs burned, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Branches clawed at my arms and face as we tore through the woods, the cold biting deeper now that we were drenched in sweat. The thought of looking back didn't even cross my mind. I didn't want to know what might be there. The scream came again, distant now, but still sharp enough to make me stumble. My mind raced. Was it a mountain lion? A fox? They could sound like screams, but this was different. Felt human. But there was no way a person could be out here, not this far from any trails or other cabins. My gut churned, and all I could think about was getting back to the safety of the cabin. The final stretch of the climb felt like a nightmare. My muscles screamed with every step, and my lungs burned in the freezing air. Dan, who was in front of me, nearly tripped over a root, and I grabbed his arm to steady him. Lisa, behind me, was sobbing quietly, her breath hitching in ragged gasps. No one spoke. There was no point. All that mattered was getting back. When the cabin finally came into view, it felt like a lifeline. We stumbled up the porch steps, threw open the door, and slammed it shut behind us. Dan locked it, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to turn the bolt. For a moment, we just stood there, panting and shivering, the silence inside the cabin deafening. I don't know how long we stayed like that, staring at each other, too scared to speak. Eventually, Mike broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered. There was no answer that made sense. The rest of the night passed in a haze. We stayed together in the living room, huddled under blankets, every creak of the cabin making us jump. Sleep was impossible. The screams echoed in my head, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving just beyond the windows. By morning, the terror felt almost surreal, like a bad dream. The sunlight streaming through the windows should have made everything better, but it didn't. The forest outside looked the same as it always did, calm, quiet, indifferent. We packed up and left that afternoon, cutting our trip short. No one argued. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened that night. I've read about animal calls that sound like human screams, but nothing fits what we heard. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just some animal. It felt deliberate, like it wanted us to hear it, to feel that fear. I haven't been back to the cabin since. My parents still use it, and my friends have talked about planning another trip, but I always find an excuse not to go. The thought of stepping back into those woods, of hearing that scream again, is too much. Some things are better left unanswered.